For moderator, we have Kayla Etienne Best. She is a junior at George Mason University, majoring in cultural anthropology and creative writing. She is president of George Mason University's Students for a Democratic Society. Our second moderator is Caroline McCaig. Yeah? Okay. She is also a junior at George Mason University, majoring in government and international politics and minoring in sustainability and data analysis. She is treasurer of George Mason University's Young Democratic Society of America. This is, okay, you know what? I shouldn't have put the acronyms. Why do you say? Yeah. So our first speaker is Bennett Shoop. They are an integrative studies major with a concentration in women and gender studies, focusing on Marxist feminism, LGBTQ liberation, and gay subcultures. They recently presented their research on female drag queens and misogyny at the National Conference on Undergraduate Research. So. Next up is Dr. Andrew Kliman. He's an American economist, previously economics professor at Pace. He wrote The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying the Causes of the Great Recession and Reclaiming Marx's Capital, which defends the temporal single system interpretation of Marxist labor theory against claims of inconsistency from neoclassical, neo-Ricardian, and other economists. So. Next is Dr. Richard D. Wolff. He's a professor of economics emeritus at University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught until 2008, co-founder of Association of Economic and Social Analysis and its quarterly journal, Rethinking Marxism, also co-founder of the nonprofit Democracy at Work, and also authored many books, including Understanding Marxism and Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Finally, we have Boots Riley. He's an American rapper, producer, screenwriter, film director, and activist. He is the lead vocalist of the Coup and Street Sweepers Social Club. He has had his feature film directorial debut, Sorry to Bother You, released in 2018, which won an Independent Spirit Award for Best First Feature. So, Boots Riley.
So yeah, thank you all for coming out. We can start the panel right now with our first question. So this is a question for everyone. It is, what is your personal definition of what being a socialist means to you? And in a broader sense, what is your perspective on the radical left? So we're gonna go down, we're gonna start with Bennett and go down. Just a note, try to keep questions and answers to about 3 minutes. Yeah.
Hello. So I first discovered socialism when I was in high school working for an LGBTQ nonprofit, and I read the Combahee River Collective statement that talks about their political outlook and how they expanded Marx's analysis to be intersectional. And I think that was kind of my awakening in terms of socialism. But in high school, I was very much involved in like democratic socialism as an ideology, and now as I've read more and more, I'm much more firmly a Marxist-Leninist and kind of understanding that, to me, socialism is the understanding of the class struggle expanded to the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat, as Lenin says in State and Revolution. And I think that socialism means that workers and oppressed masses are in charge of the society that has previously oppressed them, and that it is an overturning of all of these thousands of years of histories of class oppression. And what I think of the radical left, I think of all of the struggles in the 20th century that have been so vast, from, you know, the various socialist revolutions that happened throughout the world to campaigns like, you know, wages for housework, that just show that there's so many different varieties of people trying to fight for change, and that we're really just a very impressive movement that is really just working against so many different kinds of systems that are trying to make people's lives hard, and that it's a really inspiring history.
Awesome.
I basically have a lot of affinity with the thought of Karl Marx. And for, you know, you hear about socialism and it's state property versus private property, or planning versus a market economy. That's not what Marx was about. In the Communist Manifesto, he said, we will have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That's what he was struggling for. That was his vision. Okay, and I think that's what we need. So it's not about some property form, but a property form comes into it, or something like that, because what we have right now is a situation in which the vast majority of people in the advanced countries have to spend their whole life doing what somebody else tells them to do at work, or else they starve. That is the biggest social problem we face in the advanced countries today. That is unfreedom. You know, you can vote every 4 years or whatever, but day in, day out, you got to do what somebody else tells you, or you starve to death. That's not freedom. We've got to overcome that. And so people need access to their own means of production, you know, tools and buildings and stuff, so they can produce for themselves without, you know, having to do what somebody tells them. But my perspective on the radical left today is that the struggle that we got to win, there ain't going to be socialism, there ain't even going to be liberal democracy unless we win the struggle against Trumpism, white nationalism, and the far right in general.
Okay.
Okay, I think of myself as a socialist, partly because I can't imagine not being a socialist. I look around at my colleagues and friends who aren't, and I feel for them. They've missed an opportunity to be better people than they might have otherwise become. They could have led a life of making the world a better place. They missed out on the benefits that come from doing that. As to why I'm a socialist, I look at it this way. I'm part of a very old tradition. And that old tradition was the one that said there oughtn't to be masters and slaves. And then that tradition continued and said there oughtn't to be lords and serfs. And that tradition now has to say the same. There oughtn't to be employers and employees, because it's the same basic problem. I'm a socialist because I imagine an alternative that's within reach. We're not stuck in these kinds of systems. It could be otherwise. And it would be strange to go through your life unaware of it and unable to move in that direction. And what do I mean? It's real simple. Production. Producing the goods and services we all depend on could be and should be done democratically. Every person in the workplace, one person, one vote. We decide together what we produce, how we produce, what's done with the fruits of our labor. It doesn't have to be a small group of people at the top who run the show. That ought to bother you. It bothers me, and I'm a socialist because of it. And what's my view on the left? Well, I've spent the last 5 years of my life running around the United States giving talks, suddenly because there's an interest in it. And here's what I learned. That this system has worked very hard to make people who are socialistically inclined feel like they're weird and strange and unusual, and there's nobody else out there, just you. So you feel afraid of reaching out. You feel afraid of taking a risk. Here's the joke that it isn't funny. There's millions of us out there. Occupy made us aware. Bernie's efforts made us aware. My experience makes us aware. So for those of you that are here, you are not alone. There's millions of people that are a left out there. They're not well organized. That's a serious flaw. But they're there. And the job of people that are conscious is to go out there and help build the organizations on that basis, because then we can, in fact, change this society.
The phrase that I often employ is very similar to something he just said, but I usually say that the people should democratically control the wealth that we create with our labor. Very few people will openly disagree with that. I don't care where they're, because they will sound stupid. No, really, just a few people should control the wealth that everybody creates. They'll quickly try to use some other catchphrases for their ideology, but they won't go and challenge that. Because I think we all can say that if we're spending our day doing it, we should have some control over it, right? There are some folks that will argue otherwise, but most people would agree with that. And what is that system called, where the people democratically control the wealth that we create with our labor? It's communism. And we can call it whatever we want to call it. We could call it, and there's arguments that I don't need to be in that have to do with how do we get there, because that's one thing. We're here, that's there. How do we get there is something that we're only going to figure out while we do it. We can sit around and say this will work, that won't work, and we should look at history. But often what I find is that we get so caught up in that we make splits in different organizations over what color the buses will be once the revolution happens, and we don't do the actual work. So I don't really care what it's called. I know what it's called, and I'll say that I'm a communist. But, if you call me socialist, I'm not going to argue with that. You could call the system that we want to make cupcakes. I don't give a fuck. It's about what are we actually talking about. And sometimes we get caught up in these labels because we're trying to say, well, these folks that tried to do this made some mistakes, and I'm not part of that, right? They did that over there. That's them over there. But what I want to do is something new. Well, that's bullshit, because we all want to do something new. We all don't want to make mistakes that were made, but we also all have to look at what victories were gained before, right? And so this idea that we are, I have a lot of friends that might call themselves anarcho-socialists or whatever, and that's them being like, and they'll be like, you're a Stalinist. And really what it is them saying, there were mistakes made, you're part of that, I'm not part of it. But we're all here because of what happened in the past. We have no way of getting out of it. We're here because of that, and the question is what do we see that worked? What do we see that didn't work? And what are we going to do today? I think, as far as what I think of the radical left right now, I think that we've spent decades since the beginning of the new left running away from actual class struggle. That we have separated the campaigns we're doing from what our power base is under capitalism. And there are a lot of ideas about how that happened and all that kind of stuff, but we have gotten it to the point where we're involved more in spectacle than anything else. And by doing that, by being like, What we need to do is get people out on the streets, and that's the be-all, end-all. We've sold people the wrong idea about how power works under capitalism. We've sold them the idea that how power works is enough people say that we don't like something and it'll happen. And that's this idea that gives us an idea that there's a democracy under capitalism. And the truth is, we're only going to get what we want by having a movement that can withhold labor and as a strategy and tactic towards building a larger movement. And that movement can't just be about withholding labor just for higher wages, obviously, because that's very limited. But it has to use that, and it has to have a radical vision to it that says we want to build a new world, we want to build a new society. Sorry.
Go off.
As you guys may know, at Mason, the Koch brothers have been donating millions of dollars to the school using the private university foundation to avoid being accountable to FOIA requests. The Koch's agreements from other universities illustrate their attempts to control academic matters. What do you believe is the impact on public education with these growing trends of privatization through donations that allow donor influence?
I'm probably the least knowledgeable on that specific thing since, all these folks are from the academic world. But obviously, who's funding education is who's deciding, the ideology behind it. And, that's plain and simple, that often universities are about creating a management class for the system as it exists. And, and matter of fact, we were just talking about this, so I'll let them go ahead with some more details about how that happens. But we don't have, universities have turned, often we'll hear this idea, education is the key. Education is the key. Like, they'll show a picture of impoverished people, and they'll say, education is the key, right? Which does two things. One, it tells us this bullshit idea that, people are just not taking the opportunities that are out there, and they could learn a lot. And then it also, at the same time, puts out this idea that universities are mainly about the exploration of knowledge and us bettering, ourselves. They can be that. They could be that. And, but often it's around this idea of making things more efficient, making there be just the right number of impoverished people to keep wages at a certain level, making it be so that companies are run so that they can make more profits and pay people less.
I've been a professor all my life, and so I've watched in the various universities where I've taught what the highest official in each of those universities spent his, I was about to say and her, but there were no hers, his time doing. And that is getting down on his knees, begging rich people and big corporations for money. That's what he does. It should be familiar to you here at this university, because you are no exception. It should also be familiar to you here in Fairfax, where your officials did more or less the same to Mr. Bezos, didn't they? And those officials, you can count on them not to be in the business of promising nothing in return, because that's the fastest way to turn off the donor, who knows that there are 50 other universities who will give him everything. So of course, the university gives to the donor what the donor requires to be a donor. You can live in a fantasy world where you pretend that's not the case. But unless either you were prepared to pay the price, or the state was prepared to fund education, without one of those options, you're going to be begging so that the rich keep you going. And they will make sure that education serves their interest to reproduce their situation and not some interest that other people have to go in a different direction. Final little point. In countries that are also capitalist, human beings have decided this is an intolerable way of running education. They actually think, I'm thinking here of Germany, they actually think that education is so important that it shouldn't be dependent on corporate funding, and it shouldn't be dependent on your funding either. All higher education in Germany is free. Zero tuition, zero fees. And not just for German citizens, for anybody, like anybody in this room. If they can do that in Germany, it ought to bother you that they can't do it here. Ought to bother you a lot.
An example of that is the pharmaceutical industry, which often will be able to cite certain studies by scientists who also went to school and were funded by them, right? And so we come out with certain ideas about antidepressants, because there's a lot of money in that, other medications. And even though there'll be a rogue group of scientists who will say, no, all of this is bullshit, they're not doing their testing right, antidepressants actually cause depression in many cases, all this kind of stuff. I was in Europe, and any psychiatrist you talk to here, I had some family members that I had to talk to psychiatrists about, they're all in lockstep with this idea because it brings in money. And they won't say that, they don't understand that about the learning that they got, but they'll not look at certain studies that go against what they learned in school, and that was funded by a certain thing. But now when I went to Europe, I was in Scandinavia, and I met a group of psychiatrists who thought that the way that people were being medicated was total bullshit in the US. And they had a different idea, and that all had to do with who funded their education. It didn't have to do with their level of learning. It didn't have to do with their experience. It had to do with who funded the education they got.
The problem is common, but you guys here seem to be confronted with an extreme version of it. Certainly when donors are allowed to screen who's hired and who's fired, which seems to be the case here from what I've been able to garner, that's an extreme case. There are extreme conflicts of interest going on between the university and Mercator, as far as I can tell. And they both have a conflict of interest policy, each one of them, but they're not adequate. So I certainly, support you in your struggle. But this has been going on a very long time, and it's going to go on within capitalism as long as capitalism exists. I want to read you something Karl Marx wrote 150 years ago. He was referring to the situation from about 1830 onward. And he said, at that point, the class struggle took on more and more outspoken and threatening forms. And that sounded the knell, the death knell of scientific bourgeois economy. It was thenceforth, from then on, no longer a question whether this theorem or that one was true, but whether it was useful to capital or harmful, expedient or inexpedient, politically dangerous or not. In place of disinterested inquirers, there were hired prize fighters. In place of genuine scientific research, the bad conscience and the evil intent of apologetic. So what you're confronted with is a long-standing problem, hired prize fighters. And why is it taking place? Because these people are under threat, okay? They're fighting back with propaganda because they feel threatened. Okay? Prior, if they were not under serious threat, if this was a ruling class that felt secure, they wouldn't have to try to rig the system in terms of ideology. Okay? So we often overstate their power. These people are not as powerful as they seem. That's why they have to rig things. That's why they have to rig the elections in terms of suppressing voting rights, in terms of Citizens United, all the rest of it. Okay? Ann Coulter said in 2016, this is our last chance. In other words, this is the last chance for white supremacism in this country, because of the changing demographics and just the changing sentiment of the country. These people are not as powerful as they seem, okay? And that should give us some hope and some courage.
So as a Mason student, I experienced this firsthand. I think that a lot of the politics at Mason are utterly despicable, and I think that George Mason has set up these little like fascist training camps that just funnel people through the Mercatus Center into being part of a horrible and wide-reaching network of oppressors. And I think that as students, the fact that we have to sue our school to know who is donating money to us and with what strings attached, I think is absolutely horrifying. And I think that it is essential that we counter this kind of academic influence, because they are teaching ideas that go against the fundamental tenets of what makes people a human being. And the idea that all of this individualism and all of this, care of the self and no other, I just think that it's just some weird libertarian bullshit that we need to, overcome as a school.
Thank you.
So our third question, we're going to stick around talking about Mason. Professor Wolff, you mentioned this briefly, but we're going to talk a little bit about Amazon. So like you mentioned, they will soon be breaking ground on their second headquarters in Northern Virginia, with George Mason University supporting Amazon heavily throughout the process. We have a planned expansion of our Arlington campus it's going to be really big. I can't remember the exact number, and it will provide a labor pipeline from the university to Amazon. How would you contest the practice of entrusting the growth of a community in the hands of corporations? How can we incorporate a mindset that prioritizes a collective rather than the individual, as we've seen in this process, as it is not for the residents of Arlington now, as it is largely assumed that they will be displaced throughout the region? Boots can go first.
I mean, you all, the question is, how do we put out a political line that gives a clear analysis of what's going on? Part of that has to do with what kind of campaigns that we engage in, because we can have documents, we can have pamphlets, and we can have all of, any number of ways of getting ideas out. However, they don't stick to people unless people are involved in struggle in one way or another. Right? And so that has to do with not just the campaign around getting information out about how capitalist entities don't have the best interests of the area involved, but it has to do with people seeing where their power is and people feeling empowered. A lot of times people turn off to these ideas because they don't think they can do anything about it, because it sounds like noise to them. Same reason that some people will just turn off the news, or the same reason that people like certain kinds of news, because it's more like entertainment and it's not about them. It tells them things in a way where they can feel okay about not having anything that they can do about it, right? So the best way for us to garner engagement with these issues is to organize people in their daily lives and what they're involved in. So much of my time as an organizer was spent with people telling me, "Oh, that's cool. That's cool, that anti-police brutality campaign. That's cool. I'm down with it. But I got to go to work. I got to go pay the bills." And what's happening is that people are engaged in the class struggle individually. So they're not really engaged in the class struggle. They're engaged in a struggle against capitalism, but our job is to collectivize that struggle. So our job is not just to tell them about this idea that we don't have a foothold in, but to gain to help the community gain a foothold at wherever they are and bring in these issues as well.
I can connect this issue with Amazon to the first question about why I'm a socialist. Just look at it. For 2 years, the Amazon Corporation held a contest. Cities, towns, and states across the United States spent the scarce money they have for economic development officials and accountants and lawyers to create a begging program, or you could call it by another name, a bribery program. Each town, each state, figuring out how much of the scarce tax dollars they raised, they would offer to this Amazon corporation if only they would come. What a spectacle. The so-called democratically elected political officials begging to give money to a corporation that's already richer than God. What a picture. You want to know why I'm a socialist? How come you're not? How can you live in all of that? But I'm not done. We want to give them money. Virginia promised roughly $3 billion. New York also promised $3 billion, and they both won the contest. The big losers. They thought they won. They got ripped off royally, didn't they? But they thought they won. That you're going to give money you need for your schools and your roads and all the things that make life, but you're going to give it to the man, Jeffrey Bezos, who already has $150 billion personal wealth. He's the richest man on earth. If he had paid the money of the subsidies he got, you wouldn't have to, and he'd still be the richest man in the world. This is lunacy. But I want to leave you with a positive message. Yeah, your university supported it. Yeah, your top political officials did. They always do. But they don't always win. The governor of New York supported it, Mr. Cuomo. The mayor of New York City, Mr. de Blasio, they supported it. And they were defeated. The people of New York City gave, I won't do it here because it'll offend anyone, but you can guess which of the 5 fingers were given. And Mr. Bezos discovered that you can't always, in this capitalist society, score a capitalist win. You can go too far, and then the whirlwind will catch you. There will be no Amazon headquarters in New York City. That project is dead. It can be done, and the people of New York did it, and the people of Virginia are no different. They could do it too.
Can I say one thing that I like to interject in the talk about Amazon, and which is similar to the talk about Trump, that yes, these are extreme versions of what we're talking about. But sometimes in our campaigns against them, just like when they had the Get Bush Out of Office campaign, then you start thinking that the lesser form of them is the only thing you can have. So everybody was fine with not fine, but nobody said anything when Obama just went full bore with the war and all that kind of stuff. Similar to Amazon. I've been, as being an artist on a label, I've been on some of the biggest capitalist enterprises in the world as an artist, and I've been on the indie level. But indie just means indie capitalist. That just means they are not making as much money as they want to be making, right? And as an artist on that label, you still get fucked. You still get exploited. So the idea that, I think it's good for us to point out that what capitalism leads to are Amazons. But and that's the natural development of capitalism. You have to but it's not, just because Walmart is smaller doesn't make it better, right? Now there may be organization, as far as our fight, there might be there's pros and cons, and some things may be better situations for us. But sometimes when we focus on just the big bad Amazon or the big bad Apple or we start looking for a friendlier looking capitalism. And that friendlier looking capitalism is just more deceptive. And so I think that in that discussion we should talk about how do we stop what's bad about them? How do we stop the sweatshops? How do we stop all of those things that we don't like about Amazon?
I'm going to try to directly address the question that was asked. And I want to push back against the framing of the question, where it was something like, how do we prioritize the collective against the individual, or rather than the individual? I think that's really the wrong way to go. You know, I'm an individual. You're all individuals. You want the collective prioritized over and against you? I don't. Okay? There's another way to go. Again, I'll talk about Karl Marx, who said, we should never again counterpose society as an abstraction to the individual. The individual is the social entity. We are all social in our individuality. And what we need is a society in which the interests of the individual are those of the society, instead of the society keeping down, oppressing most individuals. We need a flourishing of individuality. So the ideological framing of this question really troubles me, because it's the ideology of a collectivist, state capitalist ruling class, I think, even if not intentionally. And these are people, they are, you know, state capitalism is a form of capitalism. These people are the class enemy, okay? We've got to not repeat the atrocities of the past. You know, mistakes are one thing, but atrocities and alien class interests are another. Now, you know, in terms of the Amazon struggle...
What does that mean, organizational?
I'm
just asking you to
You've
clear.
gotten 2 times to talk in this round. Let me have at least one. Okay, in terms of your Amazon struggle, you know, I'm with you, but the people on the ground doing the fighting can figure out the strategies a lot better than, you know, some so-called experts sitting on a stage. The one thing I would say, what's very important in all student struggles, you know, where you're involved with the community, is to talk with the community and listen to what folks want, and also reach outside to people who've been involved in similar struggles, like in New York City and past struggles and elsewhere.
That was a great critique. Thank you.
So I think that what this question makes me think of is the charge of, like, you know, authoritarianism or, you know, dictatorship at the historical examples of socialism that we've seen. And that I think the Amazon case just really illustrates that American democracy is just a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. American democracy is no more democratic than any other democracy. It's, you know, you choose somebody from the ruling class to supposedly represent your interests, who's going to make decisions based on, you know, the payroll of a company that doesn't have your best interests at heart. I mean, Amazon workers can't even go to the bathroom. Like, they have to pee in cups. That's absurd. And yet, you know, not only is our local government, you know, folding to Amazon and, you know, getting on their knees and begging for them to come here, but so is our university. You know, an institution that's supposedly supposed to stand for educational freedom or whatever they pretend to say, is really just creating another pipeline from Mason to another corporation and more corporate interests. And I think it's an utterly, again, despicable practice.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, for the next question, in light of Kavanaugh's appointment, the Women's March, the Me Too movement, and the resurgence of mainstream feminism, what do you think is the importance of feminist politics on the left?
It's the same. It's as important. It's just the idea that women are human beings, and we're fighting for the freedom of human beings. So that's very important. You can't fight for changing the system without fighting to change what happens with the oppression of women. So it's inextricable to the fight against capitalism. So.
I really can't add much to what Boots said. Any movement that wants to bring social justice around issues of wealth and power has got to confront the subordinate position that women have been crammed into for so long that we can hardly imagine the alternative. It's why it's so hard to get people to break with what they think is normal, to discover that it is outrageous and unfair. That's part of the struggle, and part of the way socialists win is by showing that what they're committed to is something that all the other oppressed people from other parts of society can identify with. That those who struggle against sexism find partners and allies in those who fight against capitalism and vice versa. That's how you build what one great Marxist thinker, an Italian fellow named Gramsci, talked about, a coalition, an alliance of the people who have a shared interest in transforming a society. That kind of a shared alliance is a majority and is capable of changing the society.
I think Me Too is a movement that can do a lot more to improve the everyday lives of women than almost anything else. You know, freedom from sexual harassment, being exposed, et cetera, it's so incredibly important. And this has independent validity. It is not reducible to wealth redistribution or struggle against capitalism. Listen to what women are saying. The issues that they are articulating and care about have a validity of their own and should not be put on the back burner, certainly, and should not be subsumed into some broader struggle. Okay? Listen and pay attention. Women are now in the lead. Women are in the forefront of the resistance to Trumpism. They're the backbone of it, and we even saw this in, you know, among the bourgeois politicians in the 2018 midterm elections. But what was Donald Trump met with his first day in office? The resistance, the Women's March, okay? From out of nowhere, self-organized, 4 to 5 million women and also men, and I was proud to be part of it. But this was the leadership of women, and we've got to listen to them, and we've got to respect their leadership, because they are the ones that are in the forefront right now. You know, at a certain moment in the history of the US, black people were in the forefront. Civil rights struggle, youth against the Vietnam War. This is the moment of women being in the forefront. Why are they in the forefront? Because they have so much to lose, because the pussy grabber in chief is occupying the White House. And they're saying, no, we're not going to go back, okay? And so they have an implacable resistance, not just to taking away of health care, although that's important, and not just to, you know, one thing, whatever it might be. They're opposed to the totality of Trumpism because it is so disgusting and anti-human, okay? And women feel the fear of their rights and liberties being taken away, okay? And they have the resentment and just the hatred of Trumpism. And that's why they're in the forefront. So this feminist politics, to me, is the key to everything. We should make sure that the social democrats don't eclipse it, don't let everything be reduced to so-called class struggle, which is just income redistribution and a few, you know, redistributive programs. The rights of women, okay, really come first here, because they are the ones who are most threatened. And I haven't even mentioned Kavanaugh and abortion and Gorsuch and so forth.
Class struggle is not just income redistribution. It is not at all. It's about it's about who has the power over society. That doesn't just happen from redistributing income. It happens to do with who's in control, and you can redistribute income a little bit and still have capitalism.
So I'm a Marxist feminist. That's my jam. My exposure to socialism was the Combahee River Collective Statement. That was my first exposure to Marxism, and I think that Marxist feminism provides us with an essential framework for understanding capitalism. Just an example, Silvia Federici, one of my favorite author, she, theorized that primitive accumulation is not just a one-time thing. Primitive accumulation is a consistent process. And a lot of people aren't hearing these ideas because a lot of men on the left don't think that feminism has worth. And a lot of men within socialist movements don't think that feminism is important. But feminism is essential. I think of the statement that Clara Zetkin, who was a socialist in Germany in the early 20th century, and she says, if husbands before could sometimes beat their wives to tame her, capitalism is now taming her with scorpions. And I think that by utilizing a Marxist feminist framework, by looking to people like Federici or Angela Davis or Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who was just here, I think that we can understand capitalism and class struggle and anti-racist struggle and anti-sexist struggle so much better, because Marxist feminism has really been at the forefront of expanding Marx's analysis and making it so much more inclusive and powerful.
Thank you.
That all was awesome. So next question. So Western superpowers such as the United States and the United Kingdom launched extensive anti-socialism propaganda campaigns throughout the 20th century in order to condemn the left as inhumane and the ultimate threat to freedom. And we kind of touched on that earlier. How do you respond to these attacks on the morality of socialism? Along with that, how would you deconstruct the capitalist myth of the free market? And this is starting with Boots again.
Culture is an outgrowth of how we survive. That's just how it is. It's not something mystical. It's not something genetic. It's tradition. Even when we talk about tradition, it comes out of humans creating things that make what they do to survive easier, or work around that, or and so. And I always say this, like, you can try to teach a fishing village to sing agricultural songs because you decided that agricultural songs are better or whatever. And they, if you come up with a tune that's nice enough, they'll sing along. They'll sing that, but after a few years, start changing that melody, changing those words of that melody to something that has to do with fishing, because they got a river running right through there. And that's how they survive. And their culture will come out of that. If you wanted to change their culture to having something to do with agriculture, with agriculture, you better take them to where they can plant. And then they'll start having a culture that has to do with that. Now, if we want to talk about morality, how do we make a world in which people are treating each other fairly? How do we do that? And that has to start. It doesn't mean it's the end, but it has to start with how our economy is set up, because that's how we survive. And that's where everything will grow from. And it just makes it, and so if you have an economy in which the people democratically control the wealth that we create with our labor, then you have the possibility. That doesn't mean that you don't have people treating each other unfairly. That's a struggle that still takes a while, but you're not going to win it. You're not going to make gains until you have something in which the people have that power and the ability to do those things. Now, when we're trying to create a system, when we're trying to create anything in life, there are people that take advantage of that. There are mistakes. There's all sorts of things like that. The question is still, which thing has the moral authority? Which thing has the moral authority overall in concept? And which one are we going to fight for? Which one is going to lead us to fighting for other things? That's just the basic question. So after that, you can get into critiques of what people did and what people will do, but you have to have that framework first. And so, you know, I think the basic thing is that when capitalists when capitalists try to talk about the morals of socialism, I say, well, you know, capitalism is based on a few people exploiting the many. There's nothing moral about that. And everything that there is that's set up to uphold that is just a sham to cover that up.
Yeah, for me, it's very similar to what Boots says. For me, it starts with the organization of the workplace. You know, for adults, that's where we spend most of our lives. 5 out of the 7 days, the best hours of the day, we're at work. If we're a society that has any genuine moral commitment to democracy, then the first place it should have been instituted is where we spend most of our time, at work. And that has been the place from which democracy has been excluded from the beginning of capitalism, including in this country. We do not organize workplaces democratically. We never have. A tiny group of people, the capitalists at the top, whether it's an individual or a family or a board of directors of a corporation, make all the decisions. The majority of people, the employees, have no say whatsoever. They do what they're told. Many of you are preparing, whether you're aware of it or not, to play that subordinate role in the rest of your life. That's a society that has given up much claim to morality. But we could go on. 1%, the top 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. That's a result of capitalism. What else could it be the result of? 20% of the people get the bulk of the income, 2/3 of the income in the United States, leaving the other 80% to fight over what's left. And fight we do. These are not moral arrangements. Of course, the ideology around the world has to find something to beat up on socialists for, because if you allow the socialists to focus on the things I just said, the game is over. The morality contest is done. So you find things in socialist societies that aren't so good. They have those. They're not nirvana. They're just another stage in the human development. They have problems to solve. The society that came out after we abolished slavery, it still had problems, but it didn't make the abolition of slavery a mistake. It was a step forward. And going beyond capitalism can and will be the same, because it will be moving forward and allow other problems to get attended to. There'll still be struggles. No one is subordinating anything, but there is something core to the production of the goods and services without which we can't live, and that core has to be faced, and that's where capitalism's morality collapses and where the socialist alternative has a powerful way forward.
Yeah, in terms of critiquing the free market ideology, we're giving away Marxist Humanist Initiative, this little free flyer, purple. Everybody pick this up. This is a debate that I had with a libertarian economist, Per Bylund, in Sweden 2.5 years ago. It lays out, I think, a very effective critique that has not been answered, having to do with the so-called primitive accumulation. you know, what they did to rig this free market after they took away everybody's property. They took away the property of the immense majority of the farming population so that they had to work for other people, and then they said, okay, now now we'll have property rights. It's a scam. But do you guys know the term whataboutism? Whataboutism? What we're hearing is a good deal of whataboutism. Okay, oh, you can't critique the morality of socialism because capitalism's worse, or the capitalists do this and that. The hell with both of them. To hell with the capitalists, to the hell with the state capitalists that call themselves communists, but were really capitalists. Okay? People do not want that kind of system. And what we have to do as socialists, those of us who are genuine socialists, is to distinguish genuine liberatory socialism from that monstrosity and the atrocities that were committed in the name of socialism, but it's phony. Okay? Now, I know, what Jordan Peterson is going to say and so forth. They try to tie genuine socialists to that kind of thing. Well, if that's what they want to do, I will tie Jordan Peterson to Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump and so forth. Okay? None of that makes any sense. But this is the road to genuine socialism and forward movement in this country and throughout the world, is to battle the people who have usurped the name of socialism, created monstrous, horrible, dictatorial, unfree systems, because people don't want that. And people don't want it. They say, I don't want socialism. No, you don't want state capitalism. You don't want totalitarian, Stalinist dictatorship. So it's not just a matter of being sectarian and disuniting. It's a matter of reclaiming the liberatory concept of socialism against all of the travesties that have been committed in its name, so that it really means something, beyond like Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, the redistribution, real, genuine liberatory socialism. We've got to get behind that, but we've got to win this struggle against the people, who usurped the concept of it. That battle is still going on, even though the USSR fell, even though Mao's China, morphed into a private form of state capitalism and so forth. We're still fighting this battle, and we will, until people realize that that kind of stuff was not socialism, but the opposite. A form of capitalism, not private capitalism. It's different from private capitalism, but it's still capitalism. Accumulation for accumulation's sake.
So, kind of a differing perspective. So, I very much think that all of these things that we've heard about, as was mentioned, Mao's China, the Soviet Union, Cuba, like understanding the historical relativism of the historical perspectives that were upholding these kinds of ideas were written by people with direct ties to the Nazi Party. The supposed famines that happened in the USSR, the people that wrote about those were Nazis, actual literal Nazis, associated with Hitler. And I think the same thing, is happening with Cuba through the US propaganda campaign, and the same thing is happening with China, which, has had some issues, obviously. But it's all of these things are happening, and they're a direct and intentional discrediting of socialism that happens to create a different and alternative history, by listening to people that lived through these countries and were like, hey, we want that back. I mean, people are in Russia right now are like, we want Stalin back because Putin is so awful. And I think that it's absolutely ridiculous that we have not been able to move on beyond these kinds of fake histories that were taught in our high school classes. And when you think about suffering and whatever, when you think about the Great Depression, what happened to the Soviet Union when the Great Depression happened? They achieved economic growth because they had an economy that was planned. And I think that, if we're looking at those examples, we can see, those places weren't perfect. Obviously, nothing is. But if we
learn not only from their mistakes, but also from their achievements. That is how we learn how to go forward.
Can I ask a question? So with that sort of phrase and that I say that the people should have democratic control over the wealth they create with their labor, do you disagree with that idea?
No, but I think it's kind of on the surface.
Okay. So the basic ideas that we're talking about, which many of us define in different ways, that have been talked about up here, it sounds like you agree with those things, but maybe they're not being enough about them are not being articulated.
No, I think that we're using the same words to mean different things.
Okay.
So, you know, this is the beginning of a long discussion, but the folks here have their questions. If they want to ask us this question, I'll be happy to go into it.
I thought
but
we were
I don't want to
having
take
a
over
conversation.
the event, you know? I have time. Well, okay. Do you think that the people democratically controlled their wealth in Stalin's USSR or Mao's China?
I'm saying this is what we're fighting for. Do I think that there has been something that has achieved communism? No, even the Soviet Union said that they were fighting for socialism. They never said that they had
No,
achieved
they said
communism.
they had achieved socialism and they were fighting for
No,
communism.
that was under Khrushchev. They said they achieved socialism.
Okay.
That was later in the 50s.
Okay.
After the,
Okay.
you know. So my point is, and I disagree with that. So I don't think anybody up here is without critique of the USSR, of China. Matter of fact, many of us have laid those out. And so it's kind of it's a false idea that people are without critique to call themselves socialists or communists. The point is my question is, what kind of a society are we fighting for? And I guess my second question would be, has there been any movement that has gotten big enough that are fighting for people's rights that you think was worth saying right on?
That kind of
Good
goes
try.
to our next question. That is our next question is about about liberation struggles. So do you mind if we move? It's basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, I was totally waiting for Bennett to bring up Stalin. I'm so happy you finally did.
Okay. So the next question is, what is the role of student movements in the growth, support, and fight for a socialist future? And what is a liberation struggle that inspires you and that you think provides an important example for resisting colonialism and imperialism? So yes. Bennett, you can start.
Okay, so I want to take this time to talk about some people that I met when I went to NCUR in Georgia. So we were at a university, Kennesaw State, and we met an organizer there from KS United, who I wanted to extend a hand of solidarity to through this panel discussion because they are fighting a very uphill battle. They are fighting against university repression. The police are being called on their students for chalking to intimidate them. They are fighting against racism and homophobia and transphobia and Islamophobia on their campus even more so than we have here at Mason. You know, the school is removing their support from women and gender studies programs, from LGBTQ resources pamphlets, from, you know, specific like posters made by, you know, African American studies at the school. And there's just so much happening that they formed a coalition of faculty and students and community members, which is not recognized as a school organization, which is their excuse for, you know, their punitive measures. But they're just demanding that the president denounce racism, and she's not. Dr. Whitten is not denouncing racism, and she has not taken action to promote or to create the Anti-Racist Education Center that had been promised to the school twice over the past 10 years. And I think I want to allow people to see just how far, you know, and how important student movements are for this movement to cut against this kind of university repression that's not just at their university, but that is in league with Georgia lawmakers to promote this kind of conservative agenda that is directly oppressing the student body. And you know, they refused to, you know, condemn the actions of a student who threatened a black student with the KKK. Like, it's absolutely unacceptable, and I wanted to take this moment so that people are familiar and aware of the struggle that they are having against their school and extend that solidarity from George Mason to them. Because, as the incoming president of YDSA, I think, or what was formerly known as YDSA, we're changing a name. But I think student movements are really important, and so I wanted to take my time to talk about that. But just a quick answer to the liberation struggle. I think Cuba's really nifty.
To try to answer Boots' question directly, I think actions speak louder than words. So if one says, I'm for people's democratic control, over wealth, and then they end up supporting, being apologists for, minimizing atrocities, totalitarian oppression, calling state capitalism socialism. I mean, if it's state capitalism, that's a form of capitalism, Rick. How can it be socialist and state capitalist at the same time?
What are you talking about?
You talked about socialist societies. Yeah? You've previously called, the USSR state capitalist.
You're going to debate with something I said at another occasion?
I'm going to look at your body of work and try to understand how you can call something socialist and state capitalist.
We're not here to discuss my body of work. What are you talking about? And why are you doing this?
I'm trying to answer his question.
No, you're trying to be combative.
No, I'm trying to answer his question.
My mistake, you're not combative.
Look, if I'm combative or not combative, that's not the issue. I'm trying to answer his question.
Then why do it?
Why should I? Okay.
Difficult.
Why
No.
will I answer his question?
It's difficult. Must be difficult.
What's difficult?
I have no idea what you're talking about. Nor does anybody else.
Okay, look. Let me go back to the basics. We have to reclaim the vision of liberatory socialism. That can only be done by merciless, ruthless criticism and condemnation of those systems that usurp the name and impose totalitarian control and unfreedom on people. This is not what I'm about. This is not what genuine socialists are about. And as long as those two things are confused, the cause of socialism is going to suffer, and I don't think it's going to advance at all. Okay? We're talking about the future of the world here. It's not a matter of trying to be difficult or combative. Okay? So, again, actions speak louder than words. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of the people struggling for freedom, whether it's Western capitalism or other systems of unfreedom, or are you on the side of the oppressors? That's always the question. And for, all kinds of great liberation struggles, that's the question. The African liberation struggles, the Asian revolutions, Latin America, 50s and 60s. But my heart really goes out to the Hungarian freedom fighters in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And it was started by youth, and it involved the whole population, and they were massacred by imperialist Russian tanks, and Chairman Mao from China was, egging on the Russians, crush these people. Excuse me? They were led by Nazis. Okay. Sure.
Can we go on?
Sure. Wait, are you uncomfortable with this discussion?
So we will not be taking questions from the audience. We will have a Q&A from the audience in a little bit. But if everyone in the audience could refrain from speaking right now, please.
Yeah, one of the weaknesses of the left is a tremendous desire upon parts of it to have a debate over who's genuinely in the club and who's genuinely out of it. I think that's done more damage than almost anything else that the left, particularly in this country, has done to itself. People want to call themselves socialists. That's their right. There's no agency that hands out certificates to determine whether you are or not a socialist. People mean different things, and we can discuss what those differences are and whether they matter or not. but the argument about who's got it right and who's got it wrong belongs in a religious institution, and we're not in one of those at the moment. So I'm not going to go there. I think the issue of a movement that I think deserves a lot of attention, more than it's gotten, is not a half a century ago in Hungary, but right now. It's called the Gilets jaunes. It goes on in France. Here it gets translated as yellow vests. For the last 24 weeks, every Saturday, there are demonstrations of between 20 and 100,000 people in hundreds of cities and towns across France, demanding fundamental economic change, along with the démission, the French call it, the getting rid of Mr. Macron, the president of their country, who's got a lower popularity rating than almost any other Western leader. He's in a neck-and-neck fight with Theresa May in England for that honor. Okay, in this situation, you have seen for the first time a massive working class movement separate from all the political parties, bringing together people who have not worked together in a political movement ever before, in many cases. It's an extraordinary movement. Everything the president of France could bring against them, police, water cannons, meeting them halfway on their demands. He's tried it all. He even tried to use that fire a couple of weeks ago in the Notre Dame Cathedral to position himself as the great restorer of the cathedral, only to find his posturing shot down when the Yellow Vest movement turned it around and said, yeah, you were able to raise $1 billion from 3 or 4 corporations in France to rebuild the tower. Those were the same corporations you didn't go to deal with the low salaries and the abandoned public services. The money was always there. You've just proved it. You didn't have the political courage to get it. And instead of being the hero, he's a bigger dunce today than he was before the fire. That's a movement that knows how to build on the strength of large numbers of people in motion. And they've made the economic conditions the #1 focus. They have a bigger participation of women who are often in the leadership than movements like that have had in France before. So it shows again the ability to bring things together. There is a movement that is profoundly socialist, profoundly anti-capitalist. Their latest statement, and by the way, they're gearing up for a massive across France motion, and they picked an interesting day, about a week from now, May Day, May 1st. Look for it. You will see there the movement of people that could have an echo here in this country and could be a profound way of moving the movement forward.
So I remember the part about what liberation struggles we like, but what was the first part of the question? I forgot.
What is the role of student movements in the growth, support, and fight for a socialist future?
Well, I think that we have to get the radical left back into into structuring campaigns in a way that it shows how power works, right? And that also we can have, and that way we can also have more campaigns that we win, which I think is going to start to be necessary, right? So I think one thing students can do, you get out of college, you go salt someplace. You know what salting is? You get a job someplace with the express purpose of forming a union there. And with just basically to get in there, meet people, form a union. But we need a new, radical, militant labor movement that uses the withholding of labor as a strategy and tactic for winning campaigns and turning into a more radical movement. Now, for that to happen, it can't just be around wages, things like that. But those are the things that people are dealing with, and that's what will probably be the thing that it would start with. But it has to go beyond that, and it has to be led with an outward, with an open, radical vision. Think about it like this. If when Mike Jones got killed in Ferguson, if there had already been 20 years of radical organizing of labor there, and there was and there had been, a general strike, or not even that, 1/5 of the workforce in that area shutting things down, you would have had an indictment. You would have had an indictment right away. Who knows? It could have took a week and a half, 2 weeks, but that would have scared people, because that's where power is. Everyone knows no matter where on the political spectrum they are or how advanced they've learned about it, people know the idea that the people with the money have the power. That you learn that from just watching stupid TV shows, right? The thing is that we don't teach them is why does that equal power, and how do they get that power? How do they get that wealth? And that has to do with us creating that wealth while we're on the job. So I think, and right now, only 7% of the workforce is organized in any way, at least on the job. We have 93% of the people to go. We can make a radical new movement that deals with that, and that combines that power with things that are thought of as social justice movements. And so I think that's where we need to go. As far as liberation struggles that I can point to, as was said here, I'd also like to point out that, I've been part of organizations that have a heavy critique of the USSR, have a heavy critique of China, but with that critique means that you have to look at the successes, because it's not a critique if it's only condemnation. That's not scientific at all, right? And so you have to look at how things were won, and the idea is about building a society that the thing that I want to see hasn't been built yet. But now it's going to take time to get there. And if we do create some big movement that is fighting for communism, fighting for socialism, you bet there's going to be mistakes along the way. Does that mean everybody should condemn it and get rid of it? No, that means that you critique it, you transform it, and you keep moving on, right? The folks that don't want to see a revolution and would rather just be right will sit on the side and be like, they're not right, I told you. So, which leads me to a movement that I will point out, and that's the colectivos in Venezuela, right? Colectivos in Venezuela are thousands of neighborhood autonomously organized groups. They existed there before Chavez came to power, many of them, and they grew once he came in there. Now, many of them have different things. Like there's some that focus on LGBTQ rights. There's some that focus on just food distribution, and there are some that are armed, luckily. And many of those that are armed are doing so in response to the right-wing opposition that was burning down polling places and killing people at certain points. But the point is that those colectivos are the Chavista movement. Many of them are to the left of Maduro and have heavy critiques of him. But that doesn't mean that they are in opposition to him. They understand that he is the representative of the movement that they've built for all of these years. And they understand that for them to move forward from where they are, that they have to fight the USA-aligned, IMF-aligned opposition who wants to cut most of the social services because that's what the IMF does. That's how they do it. And who wants to privatize much of the industry that has been that has been nationalized. So those folks, those colectivos, are the poorest of. Most of them are of the poorest of Venezuela, and they are there fighting, and they are in. This is not the end point of what they're fighting for. The system that they have there. Matter of fact, it's what they have in Venezuela is more of a social democracy than it is socialist. But the movement there wants to fight for a socialist world. And those are the people on the ground. And when people are defending Venezuela from a coup or opposition, for me, that's defending those people. And Maduro is just their representative that they elected, partly because he's who Chavez said to elect. So, anyway.
Awesome. So we're running a little bit over time, so this next question is going to be our last one. Try to keep it a little bit on the shorter side. No, everyone did so good. So what steps should individuals take in order to reach this goal, and that goal being a future without capitalism? So this is pretty much what people take away from this event and be like, oh, I need to go do this, and this will help me get to this future without a capitalist system.
Join a party. There's lots of socialist organizations out there. PSL is one of them. We have a YDSA branch here, although name change. But, join an organization. You can't organize against capitalism alone. There's a lot of people doing a lot of really good work organizing against homelessness and hunger, and just also providing simultaneous education campaigns. Those things are really important to not only uplift, but also to be a part of, educating yourself and engaging yourself in the struggle, not just for yourself, but for the entire community that you live in. These are nationwide organizations. It's not just some, club that you go to have a fun time. This is a thing, or, an organization you join just to, intellectually just jerk yourself off because of how intelligent you are. But join a party, join an organization, do something. That's the step you need to take. Reading a book can only help you do so much.
Well, I think what people need to think about is the struggle is going to be a very, very long one if we're going to succeed at all. And how can you change your life and the way that you do things so that you have the staying power to be in the struggle throughout? And I've seen over the years and decades so many people fall by the wayside, get discouraged, they get pissed off at this organization that screwed them over, that campaign that failed. So one has to reorganize oneself. How do you pick yourself up from that and continue forward so that you just don't say, I did that when I was young, and I'm sick of it, it didn't work. Well, maybe if you would reorganize your thinking and combine with other people who were trying to reorganize their thinking, you could surmount these obstacles and contradictions. There is really no other way to have that staying power if you're at all a thinking person. When you face these setbacks, when you face the internal struggles, and the struggles never end. People who were, you thought they were your friends, they become your enemies. They get bought out, they're sellouts, they get co-opted, their ideas change, and so forth and so on. So the idea is always to keep your eyes on the prize, and always, what that means is don't ever focus on some immediate goal like that is going to be the solution. It looks like the solution, but it's probably going to turn into its opposite and be used against you. So you got to use your brains a lot. You got to think a lot, and books are really helpful there. And they're really indispensable, I think.
I agree, but I won't repeat that it's important to be part of an organization. Americans have a hard time doing that. They're very suspicious. They have been for a long time, and there are good reasons for that. But you do have to overcome that because you're dealing with a social problem, and individual solutions don't exist for social problems. If you got a social problem, you need a social movement to deal with it. But I want to also talk to you as an individual about what you can do. And here I need to tell you a very brief story. We know a little bit about the history of economic systems in the world. We know, for example, that slavery in various places was born, it evolved over time, and then it died. And we know that feudalism was born, lord and serf system, it evolved over time, and then it died. You get the pattern? Capitalism was born, we know that. It's evolved over time. We know that too. You know what the next stage is? It dies. And unlike Andrew, I'm not sure it's going to take a long time. In 1980, middle of the 1980s, the Soviet Union thought it would last forever. In a very short time, it was wrong. We don't know what the time frames are. We don't know how big the contradictions here are and how they'll play themselves out. But if you're thinking as an individual, it might be important when you're in a room with your friends, your relatives, your co-workers, and someone talks as though capitalism has always been here and capitalism will be always here and we have to work within the limits, you become the voice that says, no, we don't. The system, too, can change. It may be as important as not allowing a homophobic comment to be made or a racist comment to be made, but a comment on the perpetuation and the perpetual existence of capitalism has its own ideological effects that it's worth combating, and that you can do as an individual.
Another in the echo chamber of people need to join organizations. I was involved in Occupy Oakland, and seeing the whole Occupy around, it really just reinforced the idea that you can have a lot of people. You know, there was an Occupy encampment in every town, right? At a place that at that time was the closest to a class analysis we had seen in a mass movement in the United States, which was the whole 1%. It was close, right? But yeah, it fell apart because there was it was without being in a disciplined organization, and whatever that means, that could be a lot of different things. But without being in a disciplined organization, it was easy for people to be like, I disagree with you, fuck you, I don't ever need to work with you again. Because there was no idea of how this could become anything else. And that has to do with organization. And that has to do with doing something intentional. And yeah, and definitely there's something against, you know, parties, organizations. I don't care what you call it, but it's a party. There needs to be something, some network of smaller organizations as well, that can make things that work for folks. But you got to start it by joining something.
Thank you to all of our panelists. That was a very interesting and informative discourse. And that concludes our panel portion of the event. We will be now moving into Q&A. We have 2 microphones on either side of the stage here. Please limit your questions to 1 question with no follow-ups. And if you do have a question for a certain panelist, you can direct to them. So please quickly and quietly make an orderly line to either of these microphones, and I will let you know when it's time to go. Yes.
I just wanted to remind everyone that this is a discussion, not a debate, so please keep that in mind while you're asking your questions.
Thank you. And thank you to our moderators. Let's give them a round of applause. Alrighty, we're gonna start on my left here, and we'll go back and forth between these two mics for the remaining time that we have. This portion will last 30 minutes, so keep that in mind.
This is a question for Boots. Being a communist filmmaker, how do you protect your art from being labeled as propaganda?
I mean, I think everything is propaganda, first of all. Everything is someone putting out an idea. Whether they're conscious, whether the maker is conscious of it or not, or whether the receiver is conscious of it or not. Like, everything you've ever seen in your life has an idea, a perspective to it. And so, but when people are labeling one thing propaganda, what they're actually doing is saying all this other stuff, all the Die Hards, all the Mission Impossibles, all the, whatever, 3 Men and a Baby or whatever, none of that is propaganda. And so that's my problem with that. But I have a point of view, an artist has a point of view, and what we're doing is communicating ideas. I think there is a way, when I first started out doing music, it was a lot more mechanical. It was about me saying, okay, I have these ideas. I want people to know I have these ideas. And it was just like me shouting out different names and, saying different, capitalism or whatever. And after a while, I figured out that to the extent that art is worth it, it has to do with humans communicating to each other. And so I stopped using, and I realized also that certain lingo that we have on radicals have are shortcuts, but they also stop us from understanding what we're talking about and stop the listener from understanding. So a lot of people can say capitalism, and we'll keep saying that, but actually some people, you'll say capitalism, and they think you're talking about, how you get advertised to on TV or whatever. And so I kind of changed those things and started talking more about from a human experience of, my dealings with the system I'm in, and expanding from there and just making sure that I'm true to myself. And I think that's why my art has come out in a different way than sometimes when people get excited about whatever they're believing and make that thing about that, whatever.
Thank you.
Take a question from over here now.
Hi. Something that has been sort of a problem in the past years of organizing in leftism, anti-capitalism, socialism, and other liberation struggles is the extent to which, and I know this is probably something that gets brought up a lot, but it's something that I didn't hear you guys comment on it, and that's the Eurocentrism of socialism, and the fact that it seems in a lot of organization spaces I've been, it's like it starts, French Revolution goes up to 1917 and boom, so socialism died. But it's like, since then, the forefront of national liberation has been almost exclusively people of color. Theory, revolutionaries, movements, successes. And yet, we still find ourselves, reading Rosa Luxemburg over like, I'm not saying don't, what I'm saying is like, and I'm not advocating like, bringing up people of color on par. I'm asking like, is there a way, do you guys think it's smart, because I want to know what you guys think, to reconfigure what we mean by anti-capitalism so that it centers the reality of colonialism, Colonialism came before capitalism. You can be anti-capitalist without being anti-racist. You can't be anti-racist without being anti-capitalist, right? So I feel that emphasizing the role of race within the modes of production gives us that. So how do we, as students, in America, make those moves without, one, tokenizing, and two, without seeming like we're too far off, obsessed with outside causes that's not directly relevant to students here?
One thing is, for myself, part of my move away from using certain lingo because I felt like I had a barrier between myself and who I was communicating with was that I say that I'm a communist, if you want to call me socialist or whatever. I don't say I'm a Marxist because, as Marx pointed out at one point, when he saw things saying that he was wrong about something that he thought, he said, "Oh, I guess I myself am not a Marxist." Because the point is, and I understand why people will say Marxist, because I'm not arguing that point. But my point is, for me, it's about the principle, right? It's not about just these great theorists, and there are many of them. It's not just about these great theorists, and because I'm not in the academic world, it's not like there's this star theorist right here, and I'm a Gramsciist, and I'm a this is, it's about these ideas of liberation and where the power lies. And so often in my discussion about how do we talk about socialism and communism in a way that it sounds like more reflects the folks that are in that struggle, right, openly in that struggle right now. And for me, it's just I bring those examples up of those folks in that struggle and the things that they figured out in that. And so it's maybe a different answer for everyone, because I'm not like saying, hey, I'm not even saying, hey, read Fanon, right? I'm saying, look at these folks, the important theorists to me are the ones who took these ideas and applied them, right? And so, which is, why I understand folks will be like, I'm not just a Marxist, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, or I'm a, this and that. It's about the folks that actually applied it. And so for me, it's about uplifting those struggles, those folks that were involved in the struggle.
I also would like to say that as somebody who's taken on a leadership position within an organization, one of the things that I've made a promise to do is to uplift the voices of those who are most marginalized within my organization. And I think that by encouraging people to learn, a lot of people know the history of the USSR, that's fine, whatever. But a lot of people need to learn the liberation struggles of people in Latin America and people in Africa, because the Pan-African movement and, the Cuba's liberation struggle, like those are things that are essential for understanding socialism, because you know what, they're still here. The Soviet Union is gone, and you can talk about the Soviet Union all you want, but like talking about Cuba as an existing nation or Venezuela as an existing nation, like those are the people we should be extending solidarity to and learning from, not some dead white guys who, haven't been doing anything for decades.
Awesome, we'll take our next question over here.
Hi, so this question is for Boots and Bennett specifically, but I'd be more than happy to hear from the other panelists. Just to kind of ground it in a specific GMU example and then extrapolate, as I'm sure Bennett knows and you might be aware. Sorry, okay, yeah. Okay, so like I said, this is specifically for Boots and Bennett, but I'd be more than happy to hear from the other panelists. As I'm sure Bennett knows and you might be aware, Boots, there's been a lot of organizing going on this campus around a myriad of issues. Brett Kavanaugh, sexual violence, mishandling and covering up. Obviously, Transparent has been fighting against Coke influence for a while. And we have just now kind of been receiving verbal and direct confirmation from the administration that we don't care, we're not doing anything. So extrapolating from that, once as like leftist organizers and activists, once we go through the phases of kind of being like, okay, we played by your rules, we did a petition, we did sit-ins, whatever, once they say you're doing that and we're still not going to change anything, how can we move forward to kind of work outside the parameters given to us as acceptable activism without being immediately dismissed as radical and this isn't to imply that there's anything wrong with Antifa, but the public consciousness around Antifa is just that it's bad. So just to clarify, I guess, how can we work outside of the parameters of social activism and disobedience that have been given to us when even within those parameters, it's proved that they don't change anything without being disvalued for being radical. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You're going to have to get disavowed for being radical. That's, that's just basically what, because really it's going to take you building up a movement that's strong enough to shut the place down. And only at that point will they, it sounds like from the from what I'm hearing about how the administration is acting, it's going to take you being able to shut down the campus. And that has to do with how much of a base do you have here, and and can you pull that off? But yeah, it's going to be, that's a radical action. And that's coming from a radical perspective. And so what you actually may do is change people's perspective of what a radical is. So, yeah.
If I could just add, there are companies that hire themselves out to university administrations on the grounds that they know how to control student unrest. They get big bucks for that. One of the standard ploys they advise presidents and other officials in this situation is to say that nothing these students is doing is going to have any effect. This is not a statement of analysis. This is an attempt to dissuade you from continuing. That's all it is. The truth is exactly the opposite, that it's precisely because you are affecting them that they need to tell you that you're not, so that hopefully you will stop. So my advice is go right ahead. Boots is right. They may call you any name in the book because their strategy of dissuading you by discouragement failed. But that's a win for you. Keep going.
I also think that as a Mason student, if, I'm a firm believer in a two-tactic struggle, the reform work, but also, the stuff that's maybe not so nice. I think we need to get rid of Cabrera. I think if we do not find the president of our university acceptable, then we should remove him. I think that we should be allowed to have control over who runs our university. It's our university. We're paying the money to go here. We should be in charge of who's running it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Over here.
Yeah, I have a shortcut. One, it's good to see that you have an SDS chapter here, but it's also, remember, it's difficult to maintain a lifetime commitment to this struggle. Gerald Nadler was an SDS at Columbia in 1968. Now he's the head of the House Judiciary Committee. So his politics have moved, considerably away from the idea of socialism. But the question is, I think that one of the problems with past revolutionary movements is the idea that they did not win people to the idea that communism means the end of the wage system. They tried to maintain a wage system, a better one, less inequality, and eventually it seems like over time, you just get back to where you started with more growing inequalities. You've seen that in Russia, you've seen that in China, we seem to be seeing it in Cuba and also in Venezuela. So I'm asking the question, do we think we really have to make eliminating the wage system a key component of building a serious revolutionary movement in this country?
I think it's all about where you start with that. For me, that seems like something that you'd have to already have a certain amount of workers' power to attain. It's kind of like when some people have abolished the police. I'm like, yeah, but that's probably going to take a revolution, right? So, yeah, I agree with that. With that idea, but the question is that seems like it's something for after the revolution. Are you talking about doing it beforehand?
You're not going to do it after the revolution, but people begin to have that idea. That's what we're fighting for. That's the goal. That's the strategy.
So he said that he would prefer that it be an ideal and part of the strategy going forward with any movement that may end in a revolution.
Yeah, I think you mean by wage system, what I began with is that people have to go and work for wages and do what other people tell them because they don't have their own means of production. They can't produce on their own, okay? So that's why there are wages. There are wages because, people wouldn't pay themselves wages, right? So yeah, we're not gonna have, this is the major social problem in the world, the advanced world only. But we're not gonna have a free society unless people have the means to produce and create their own life without having to do the bidding of somebody else. You know, whatever you call that somebody else, private capitalist or bureaucrat or whatever. Now, the thing is, people come to movements in various ways. People struggle for freedom for various reasons. And the point is to create the unity among these struggles. We don't have to rank them. We don't have to prioritize them. Not everybody has to have the same focal point. Okay? If we want a free society, yeah, we have to get rid of people selling themselves in order to live. Absolutely imperative. But, you know, do we have to organize every movement around that? Or can we bring people in to fight against Trumpism, to fight against the far right, to fight against misogyny? I say, hell yeah. Okay? As long as people see that all these struggles are connected, it doesn't matter where you begin.
I have to pee real quick, so I'm going to run and come back. Where's the bathroom? Out that door?
If I could just respond to this question. I think it's imperative what you say, that the left needs to argue for higher wages, but never should do that alone. We should be the people who say, yeah, we have to fight for higher wages, but we're trapped in a system where the person we're trying to get the higher wages from has every incentive not to give them to us, to delay them, and once we've gotten them, to undo them as soon as possible by every stratagem, like bringing in an immigrant and paying him less, or hiring children, or all the things we know capitalism has done. Wouldn't it be a better arrangement if we didn't have an adversary determining our wages? If we were our own employer, and then as a community, we decided together who gets what? Doesn't that be a different and better system than this struggle for wages with someone who's structurally positioned to not want to give them to us at every opportunity? It's crazy to keep fighting, then falling back, then fighting again, stop. There's a different system where you wouldn't be in this situation, and that's a way to give people a sense that their goals go beyond the higher wage, not instead of a higher wage, but it's a better system than the wage system.
1 second. So we have noticed there are no women in line right now. If you would like to ask a question and you are a woman, come find me or Kayla, and we can make sure that your question gets asked, because I don't like that very much. But we appreciate everyone asking their questions. We understand it takes a lot of courage. Gabby. But yeah, also we have like 10 minutes left, so a couple more questions. We're keeping an eye on time. You might not get to ask yours. I'm sorry. But again, if you are a woman, find me or Kayla.
Okay, we'll go over here. Jay?
So Boots mentioned earlier the power of the tech industry of Amazon bringing in workers from all over the country and displacing local residents. And he also mentioned salting. Would you encourage people in the tech industry, or even specifically those people who are gentrifying these areas, to organize themselves?
Oh, yeah. Oh. I think that everyone needs to organize where they are. Now, is that the first place I'm going to say needs to be organized? That wouldn't be where I would place my interest, but if you're going to be working in the tech industry, hell yeah, that's where you should be organizing. I think an analogous thing is what happened in in the environmental movement when I forget what was the name, Judy Berry. So there were people protesting lumber, the redwoods from being cut down, and a lot of times they tie themselves to trees and things like that. But Judy Berry started actually organizing the lumberjacks, the folks working for the forestry, for the lumber companies, and getting them to actually organize where they were. Now, she ended up getting blown up by the lumber companies and getting basically executed, but that's kind of a model of what has to happen. It's and yeah, these folks that are coming in, they're probably not the ones that are going to start wanting to organize first. So I wouldn't be worried about trying to organize them at that time. Folks like that, they come along once there's some other larger movement happening. Maybe they do, but yeah, I think that if as far as fighting gentrification, people have to be organized in other ways as well around the neighborhoods they already live in, organizing for things like rent control, organizing, tenants unions and things like that.
I think you might take some encouragement. Here's an irony of modern American capitalism. You've made it harder and harder for young people, particularly, but older ones too, to either get a decent job or to hold on to a decent job. A lot of people who had a good job, when the economy crashed in 2008, they lost that, they can never get it back. And so in New England, they went to work at a place where you could get a job relatively easily. It was called the Stop and Shop supermarket chain. Well, look what happened. They got stuck in those jobs. But they were people who recognized, because they had tumbled from a much better job to that one, they understood everything we've been talking about. And they went to work to rebuild that union. And 10 days ago, 31,000 of them went out on strike, picketing in front of every Stop and Shop supermarket in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And 2 days ago, they won. They got their wage increase, and the effort to cut their pensions and cut their medical coverage was removed. And the Boston Globe reported, and this was so important, that they had gone into the communities to build the support. They were doing the kinds of things we're talking about. And the drop-off in the week before Easter of the customer base of them was 75%. And that settled the strike, and they went back. 31,000 people doing supermarket work. America is changing. These things are now happening in a way they haven't for years.
Wonderful. We only have time for one more question, so I think we're going to have the woman go last. So go for it. Oh, and I'm sorry for all of those who weren't able to ask your questions. Please return to your seats now. Thank you.
Cool beans. Thank you for letting me ask a question. This is open to anyone who feels they have the capacity to answer.
Louder.
Louder. Hello. Cool. Sorry. I find in a lot of circles, activist circles on campuses, that a lot of, especially American socialist activists, find a disconnect between their socialist identities and the BDS or Palestinian liberation movements. How do you think younger American activists can integrate their socialist identities into being an ally for Palestinian liberation, and how have you, if at all, engaged in that sort of discourse?
So I've spoken out in favor of BDS and know many people in Palestinian liberation movements. I haven't found that disconnect, but I luckily, well, maybe people just talk to me differently than they do. But I think the question becomes, it's the same thing of what Israel is bourgeois nationalism, taken to its inevitable course, right? So put in that context, the colonizing of Palestine is something that everyone that looking for the freedom of the working class and the control of, for the working class to have control of their surroundings has to be in support of the Palestinian people having control of their surroundings. If you have I see a theoretical disconnect overall with being able to be against capitalism and not think that that folks that live in Palestine should be able to vote on who controls them, right? Like they live in an apartheid state where they don't have any say over who runs the country that really rules them, you know, so.
Yeah, I would only add that something that Boots said earlier. You can take a position supporting the Palestinian, the right to their existence, the right to the land that was theirs. But you also have to be critical a little bit when you do that so that your position is understood. For example, to directly confront the effort by those who are opposed to you to equate the critique of Israel with anti-Semitism, so that you can separate. Their effort is to avoid that. And using anti-Semitism against the left is now a major activity. It's the attempt to destroy Jeremy Corbyn's movement in England. It is done in France as well, and so forth. So that should be woven in. And finally, you should also note that it has been for a long time very convenient for all kinds of regimes we can't support in the other parts of the Middle East to focus their people's anger, a justified anger about how they're treated, on Israel as if that's their problem rather than their own internal class structures. So if you did it, contextualized it that way, you would both weaken the opposition and build the support for what BDS would like to see happen.
I think also an issue is that a lot of socialists are unwilling to engage in decolonial struggle and decolonial theory.
And that's the disconnect I was talking about, yeah.
I think that an enforcement has to happen in organizing spaces that requires people to engage in that. I think that, you know, if you're running an educational campaign and you're not having the voices of indigenous people, of decolonial theorists, like, at the forefront, then you're not building a socialist movement. You can't be an imperialist and a socialist. You know, socialism is a fundamentally anti-imperialist ideology, and I think that that needs to become more of a common thing, is the enforcement of having people engage in those struggles on the daily basis.
Wonderful, guys. This has truly been an incredible...
Can I add one more thing?
Go ahead.
That's somewhat connected. I wrote the intro to David Gilbert's book from the Weather Underground, and in it he has a lot of personal. So he's the guy that's still in prison from the Weather Underground, and in it he has a lot of personal stories about how his older sister. I mean, they're both Jewish, and his older sister was involved in civil rights movements and things like that. And all of a sudden there became an organizing body, a Jewish organizing body that was trying to get Jewish kids out of the civil rights movement and out of radical movements because they felt that would make them not support Israel. And so so that's where to me that sounds like there's a theoretical argument to be made as to why there may be a push for, for people not to look at decolonial movements and decolonial theory and still be able to call themselves a socialist specifically for that reason in a student movement.
Thank you. All right. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. Before we end today's event, would each of you like to give a closing statement? Yes, you can go last. We can start with Boots, if you'd like.
Well, it feels like we've talked a lot. I don't know. We need a closing statement. Thank you for having me. Thanks for everybody involved in this. Something that I would like to add that to my other statement about what students can do. I think for the past 20 years, I've seen the idea of being a radical as being portrayed as someone who is, anti-authoritarian, but like a badass and like an outsider. And I think that is an outgrowth of the kind of movement that we've had that has been mainly based around spectacle. and we need to change what that idea is of ourself to being someone that it is your job to have friends. It is your job to get along with people. It is your job to be able to walk through your neighborhood and know everybody, and to be in your workplace and know everybody, and to hang out and struggle with people and to get people involved. That's what an organizer and that's what a radical needs to be.
I also want to thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having the courage to come to this event, particularly those of you that spent a lot of time and energy organizing this event. You're doing it in a university that is very unfriendly to these ideas. And I think that's the kind of courage, in a sense, Boots was just talking about. You're doing it, and my hat goes off to you. I'm an economist, so a final thing I would like to say to you is just to bear with me for a moment. You have an economics department here for which the name Neanderthal would apply. But I'm not going to call it names, which of course I just did. I'm not going to call it names, but I want you to think about something. In the wisdom of this university, from your president on down, they have organized an economics department that does not contain a single faculty member who's devoted to mastering the enormous literature of criticism of capitalism, of alternatives to capitalism, so that you would at least know what in the world there is. It's as if you were being taught a very narrow dialect of a forgotten language in your linguistics course. Where is the commitment to education opening your mind? In economics, it's closing it. It's foreclosing you would even know what the options are. That's not balanced education. That's not education at all. You know what that is? It's fear coupled with indoctrination. And you ought to wonder about a university that is committed and has been for decades to be as narrowly lopsided as this. The real answer should be, shame on you. Thank you.
Yes, well, I thank all of the organizers for making this event possible, for inviting me and others, and we had an interesting exchange of ideas that are not all the same, but that was part of the remit, as I understood it, of this panel, you know, to show that not all people who call themselves leftists are the same. And I think, you know, it's important to see what the differences are, work through the contradictions. I really think we have to face, as people on the left, the tremendous crisis that we face in this country and the world faces because of Trumpism, the Trump administration. We are not going to have socialism. We are not even going to have liberal democracy if this man gets away with what he's trying to do and is getting very close to succeeding. You know, people say, well, vote him out of office in 2020. Hello, if he is not president, he can then be indicted. Do you think he's going to allow there to be elections? Maybe he will, but it's not something I bank on. I think that's a very risky, reckless kind of strategy. And there are a lot of fights we've got to engage in and a lot of issues, but we are facing a crisis in this country. And if we evade the crisis caused by the Trumpism and the far right, and just white nationalism, the white nationalist base of Trump, we're signing our own death warrant. You know, we're going to be in concentration camps or in exile or something like that. Okay. Now, let me just say one more word with respect to the struggle against the Kochs and so forth. I don't like their ideas any more than you people like their ideas. In fact, I like them a lot less. But the core issue is not that their ideas are bad. The core issue is that we live in a post-truth environment, a post-truth society in which people say anything, and as long as they got the money, as long as they got the resources, as long as they got the fan base, they can get away with it. They're not challenged. They're not forced to retract. Truth is just not upheld as a virtue and something we need to have. Okay? So it's a bigger problem than just the libertarian right. Okay? If we had a real commitment to truth and to truth-seeking and to correction of the record, we wouldn't have Trumpism, of course. So among the things I urge people to get involved with is a group that emerged with the March for Science. Okay, and I'm involved in it. It's called the Pro-Truth Pledge. And it's trying to get people, influential people, political people, to commit to truth-telling and retraction of errors and so forth. We really need a commitment to plain, old-fashioned, objective truth, and to fight the enemies of truth, whether it's, the Mercator Institute or whatever it is. They need to engage, okay, and answer the criticisms. And we need to engage and answer the criticisms. And only through that dialogue will we be able to test where the truth lies.
So first, I just want to give a big thank you to the organizers who accomplished this, to Kaylee, to Sarah, to Caroline, Kayla, and Jennifer. And I just, I also want to thank all of the... I also want to thank all the organizations that came out, to SDS, to YDSA, to SIA. I think that we're doing really good work, and that I think that, one thing I want to leave us with is that this is going to happen. Socialism is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when and how. And I think that keeping that optimism is one of the most important parts of the struggle, that it's not, can this happen? It's when.
Well, this has been a truly incredible experience and discourse. Thank you to all the panelists for coming here today. Thank you for all the people who made this event possible. And thank you to all of you who came out and participated. We are eternally grateful. Just want to leave you with a reminder, solidarity forever, and have a wonderful day.